April 7, 1945. Somewhere over northern Germany, the sky burns with the white scars of contrails. The roar of engines merges with the wind's hollow scream, high above the fading clouds of a collapsing Reich. A P-51 Mustang of the 305th 7th Fighter Group cuts through the haze. Its aluminum skin glints briefly in the morning sun, then shudders. A burst of 20 mm tracer fire tears past its tail. One shell finds home. The pilot feels the impact as a deep metallic thud, followed by a violent yaw to the left. The rudder jammed hard. At 400 miles an hour, that means death. No control in the vertical plane. No proper turn. For a second, the aircraft wants to roll and spin, nose diving into the pale sky. But the pilot doesn't bail. He pushes against instinct, tests the ailerons, feels the resistance, finds a rhythm hidden in the chaos, and turns the damage into motion. By the spring of 1945, the air war over Europe had reached its final violent crescendo. The Allies had air supremacy, but that dominance came at a cost. Missions grew longer, fuel stretched thinner, and mechanical wear pushed aircraft and pilots beyond their design limits. Every day, hundreds of Mustangs, Thunderbolts, and Lightnings swept over Germany. Their task: destroy what remained of the Luftwaffe and cripple supply routes feeding the last German armies. The 8th Air Force launched deep penetration escort missions for bomber streams that darkened the morning sky. Hundreds of B-17s and B-24s flying in tight, trembling formations. For the pilots of the 357th Fighter Group, the Oxford Boys, each sortie meant hours of high-tension flight, climbing through frozen layers of air, running rich fuel mixtures, pushing Merlin engines to the red line. Oil temperatures spiked. Control cables stretched from cold to heat and back again. In that environment, even a minor hit could cripple flight control. By April, the Luftwaffe no longer had the numbers it once did, but what remained was deadly. The pilots who still flew, veterans of hundreds of missions, fought with the ferocity of men defending home soil. Flying FW-190s and BF-109Gs, they hid in the haze, waiting for bombers to pass, then dove through the escorts like hawks. Their cannons fired short, devastating bursts. One lucky strike could shear off an elevator, puncture a radiator, or jam a rudder. For Allied pilots, these hits were not uncommon. But what made this particular morning stand out was what came next. How a moment of mechanical failure turned into a tactical breakthrough. Still, to understand that, we must first understand the machine itself, the P-51 Mustang, and why it gave Allied pilots both power and peril in equal measure. The Mustang was fast, sleek and deadly, but also temperamental. Its control system, though finely balanced, was sensitive to damage. The aircraft's rudder, a tall vertical fin guiding yaw, was connected by steel cables running through the fuselage. A single hit could seize the mechanism or jam it to one side. When that happened, the aircraft lost its centerline. The nose pulled hard to one direction, making conventional turns nearly impossible. Normally, that meant the pilot had seconds to stabilize or bail out. A jammed rudder during high-speed flight could flip a fighter into a flat spin, unrecoverable at low altitude. And yet, in April 1945, one pilot found himself facing exactly that nightmare. What he did next was not in the manual, but before that decision, before that sky and that gunfire, came years of lessons learned. In the brutal classroom of aerial warfare, from the early days over Britain to the deadly dogfights above the Reich, those lessons built the reflexes that would soon guide his hands, because by 1945, air combat had evolved beyond bravery. It had become a contest of precision, physics, and adaptation, a realm where control or the loss of it could redefine life and death in seconds. And it was in that crucible, amid smoke, stress, and split-second calculation, that the concept of turning damage into advantage was born. The 357th Fighter Group operated from Leiston Airfield in Suffolk, England. From there, their P-51 Mustangs launched across the North Sea, climbing to 30,000 feet to rendezvous with the bomber streams forming over the continent. By April 1945, these men were among the most experienced fighter pilots in the European theater. They had learned the bitter arithmetic of survival, the odds of engine failure, anti-aircraft fire, and mechanical fatigue. Every control input, every vibration in the stick, told them something about whether they would make it back. The Mustang's long-range endurance gave them the reach to escort bombers deep into enemy airspace, but it also exposed them to sustained combat stress that few aircraft, or pilots, were designed to endure. Captain John S. "Red" Carter, the pilot at the center of this account, had flown 76 missions. He was no ace by the newspaper definition, but among his squadron he was known for something rarer: consistency. He kept his head when others broke into panic. His flight logs read like a map of the war's closing chapters: Kassel, Magdeburg, Hanover, Bremen. The day before the Rudder jam, Carter had written in his combat diary, "Fighters now come in pairs. They know we have height and speed, so they wait low and climb head-on. It's not desperation, it's calculation." Those words captured the shifting tone of the air war. The Luftwaffe, though diminished, had learned to exploit the complacency of Allied escorts. They no longer sought air superiority, they sought disruption. Every surprise attack that forced a bomber formation to scatter gave German flak batteries a chance to strike, and that made escort pilots the thin line between order and chaos. Carter's P-51D Mustang, serial 44-1.327, had seen better days. The aircraft's airframe had absorbed months of strain, bullet patches along the fuselage, aileron repairs that made the control feel slightly uneven at high speed. The ground crew, exhausted but meticulous, knew that even minor asymmetry in control cables could cause unpredictable flight responses. Still, with the front lines closing and the end in sight, there was no room for rest. On April 7, 1945, Carter's unit received orders to sweep ahead of a B-17 raid targeting the synthetic oil facilities near Leipzig. Intelligence suggested only scattered Luftwaffe resistance. Few believed it. By dawn, engines roared to life along the frozen grass strip at Leiston. Formation takeoff. Climb to altitude. Fuel checked, coolant temperatures steady. As the Mustangs reached cruising height over the North Sea, sunlight broke through the high cirrus, scattering silver reflections across their canopies. They crossed into German airspace around 0900 hours. Below them lay a landscape scarred by war. Rivers turned black with oil. Rail lines snaking through forests, towns reduced to rubble. Radio chatter was minimal. Discipline was strict. The bomber formations were already visible in the distance, glittering columns of slow, steady power. At 0947 hours, contrails appeared high and to the east. Bandits, FW-190s climbing through the haze. Carter and his flight turned to intercept. Altitude advantage, minimal. Sun position, unfavorable. The engagement began almost immediately. A flurry of tracer lines and engine roars merging into chaos. In the middle of that swirling fight, Carter's Mustang took a hit. A 20mm round struck the lower empennage, severing part of the rudder control linkage and locking it at a fixed angle. The aircraft lurched violently. His left leg pressed against the rudder pedal, but it didn't move. The nose yawed left, forcing constant right aileron correction just to keep level. Most pilots would have broken off and bailed if altitude allowed. But Carter stayed. His wingman saw the Mustang wobble yet somehow maintain pursuit. The jammed rudder created an unintended side slip, a sideways drift that confused the enemy pilot following him. In that moment, what should have been fatal damage began to reveal a hidden advantage. But that realization, and the maneuver it led to, would come seconds later, under pressure, as the air battle twisted into its deadliest phase. Before that, we must explore the factors that shaped his decision, the angles that reveal how training, instinct, and machine behavior converged to turn disaster into a tactic. In air combat, seconds stretch into eternity. A pilot's consciousness divides, part instinct, part calculation, part denial. When a control surface fails at altitude, training collides with survival instinct. Captain Carter's rudder jam wasn't a clean, simple failure. The pedal resisted, grinding under his boot, as if the aircraft itself were locked in argument with him. The first instinct was physical: force the control, overpower the jam. But at 400 miles an hour, muscle means nothing. Every sudden pull sends the aircraft closer to a stall. In that instant, calm is rarer than skill. Most pilots who survived mechanical failure spoke later of an almost detached focus. Time slowing, heartbeat quieting, senses sharpening to the hum of the engine and the feel of airflow through the stick. Carter felt it too. Years of experience rewrote panic into routine. His breathing stabilized. His mind searched through a library of training: trim compensation, throttle modulation, asymmetric flight. Every pilot in the 357th had trained for engine fires, coolant loss, even aileron damage. But no manual prepared them for improvisation. Combat was the true instructor. And in the chaos above Leipzig, Carter's mind accepted something no book could teach. Control, even damaged, could be repurposed. The difference between panic and innovation lay not in strength, but in trust, in understanding the machine's new language, even when it screamed. Fighter combat in 1945 had evolved into a science of geometry and energy. Every move depended on altitude, speed, and angle of attack. A P-51 against a Bf-109 or FW-190 was a contest of radius and energy retention. Who could turn tighter, climb faster, or dive away first? With a jammed rudder, that geometry collapsed. Carter's aircraft could no longer pivot cleanly around its center line. Yaw and roll were bound together in unpredictable ways. Yet that unpredictability, deadly to a pilot used to symmetry, became a problem for the enemy too. The jam forced Carter's Mustang into a permanent sideslip, its fuselage skewed slightly off-axis. Normally that meant drag and instability. But to an opponent trying to predict his line of flight, it meant confusion. The German pilot behind him expected a clean arc. Instead, the Mustang drifted sideways through the turn, spoiling his gunnery solution. Carter realized this instinctively. By balancing aileron and elevator against the jammed rudder, he could slide the aircraft, a controlled drift across the sky. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't safe, but it created a deceptive target profile, one that disrupted the attacker's aim. Later in debrief, another pilot would describe watching Carter's Mustang slide like a broken-winged bird. But it kept turning, somehow staying in the fight. That improvised move, unintentional at first, mirrored what post-war test pilots would later call rudder-assisted slip turns, a defensive maneuver rediscovered decades later in aerobatic training. In combat, it became a one-time weapon of survival. The P-51's control harmony was both its genius and its flaw. Designed for smooth, high-speed flight, its control system linked aerodynamic balance with precise mechanical leverage. A jammed rudder upset that harmony. The rudder cables, running through pulleys under the tail, transferred pedal input to the hinged fin. When a shell fragment severed part of the linkage, the mechanism locked in a fixed deflection. The aircraft's center of lift and thrust no longer aligned. Air streamed unevenly along the fuselage. The Mustang now flew sideways, in constant yaw. Under normal conditions, such a slip would bleed energy and threaten a spin. But with enough speed and airflow, lateral control could counter it. Carter's use of opposite aileron and slight elevator pressure created an equilibrium, a crooked, asymmetric flight path that still generated lift and maneuverability. This wasn't luck. It was physics obeyed under pressure. The Mustang's laminar flow wing, designed for efficiency, retained lift even under sideslip angles that would stall earlier fighters. That design, meant for speed, now enabled survival. The damage had turned the machine's strengths inside out. Stability lost, but agility gained in unexpected form. For the engineers who later studied the combat report, it proved something profound. Even in malfunction, the P-51's aerodynamic grace held form, and that realization carried into doctrine. The U.S. Army Air Force's post-war analysis referenced this case while testing partial control flight recovery methods, a technical curiosity born from one pilot's instinctive fight for life. Commanders of the 357th Fighter Group had learned to listen carefully to what their pilots brought back from missions. Every engagement, every failure, every strange behavior of a machine in flight, all became data. By 1945, the air war had become a vast experiment in adaptation. The leadership no longer dictated fixed tactics. Instead, they encouraged innovation from below. A pilot who survived something unusual was debriefed like a scientist returning from a field test. After Carter's return to Leiston that day, he didn't stride into the operations hut like a hero. He walked in pale, eyes red from the long flight, and laid his gloves on the desk. When asked how he kept control with a locked rudder, his reply was quiet. Didn't. Just worked around it. But his after-action report caught the attention of intelligence officers. The description of using asymmetric control to deceive a pursuer was filed under unorthodox defensive maneuvers. The note was short, but pointed. Intentional exploitation of damaged control resulted in successful disengagement and probable enemy loss. Leaders understood what that meant. Combat was evolving faster than training manuals. Machines were pushed into unknown flight regimes, and pilots were learning to fly them broken, not just intact. That shift in mentality, encouraged by flexible leadership, turned isolated survival stories into tactical insights. By the end of the war, such reports were collected systematically, forming the foundation of what would later become post-war flight test procedures at Wright Field and Edwards Air Force Base. On the other side of that fight, in the fractured sky above Leipzig, the German pilot who pursued Carter likely never knew why his shots missed. His name was Feldwebel Ernst Müller, 9 JG 301. A unit still flying defense sorties against American bombers even as fuel reserves dwindled. Müller's Focke-Wulf 19 was heavier and slower at altitude, but still deadly in a dive. When he saw the Mustang's sudden yaw, he assumed it was a desperate evasive roll, a wounded pilot losing control. He adjusted his sight for a clean deflection shot, fired a short burst, and watched the tracers pass harmlessly ahead. What he didn't realize was that Carter's skewed flight path shifted the apparent angle of attack. The Mustang's sideways slide altered its projected position in space. To Müller's gun sight, it looked predictable. In reality, it wasn't. He pulled up for another pass, but by then, the Mustang had rolled inverted, cutting across his nose in a motion that defied logic. For an instant, both aircraft hung in opposing trajectories. Two specks, locked in a dance of physics and instinct. Then the FW-190 broke away, engine coughing, out of ammunition and fuel. In German post-action briefings, pilots often reported enemy aircraft spinning out of control yet recovering unnaturally. Such descriptions likely referred to incidents like this. To the Luftwaffe, it was a mystery of Allied technology. In truth, it was the byproduct of desperation, a man making chaos work. For Müller, that day ended in defeat, but not shame. He returned to base with empty tanks and one final log entry. American fighter, damaged, but turned impossible maneuver. That phrase would echo months later, in Allied intelligence translations. A small testament to how improvisation could confuse even veteran foes. War magnifies human creativity under the pressure of annihilation. Every invention, every instinctive decision in battle emerges from a place where survival and purpose converge. Carter's maneuver wasn't born of bravado. It was born of necessity. In his mind, there was no tactic, no calculated brilliance, only the refusal to let the machine decide the outcome. But after the fact, the story took on another meaning. In the quiet of the post-war years, pilots and engineers would look back and see patterns. How often innovation came not from laboratories, but from the edge of disaster. The moral question lingered. Was genius in war simply desperation refined by discipline? There was also guilt woven into the memory. Every maneuver that saved one pilot might mean death for another. The act of survival had an unseen counterpart, an enemy who failed, a machine that didn't forgive. Carter himself would later remark in a 1951 interview, "We learned from damage. We turned it into knowledge, but it came at a cost you can't calculate." That reflection speaks to the paradox of progress in war. The very instinct that saves life also perfects the art of destruction. And yet within that contradiction lies the truth of human adaptation. Our ability to find order inside chaos, meaning inside failure. The jammed rudder incident became one of hundreds filed away in military archives. Small stories that, when stitched together, formed the mosaic of modern aviation safety, test flight methodology, and tactical doctrine. Nigh 48 hours. Altitude, 21,000 feet. Location, southwest of Leipzig, Germany. The air was chaos. Contrails torn into ribbons by cannon fire and engine exhaust. Below, bombers lumbered toward their targets, filling the sky with silver shadows. Above them, the last duel between fighters raged across thin air. Captain Carter's P-51 shook violently. The rudder was frozen left, the aircraft straining against itself like a tethered beast. The control stick quivered in his grip. He kept one hand on the throttle, another steady on the trim wheel, feeling for balance. Every movement had to be exact. A fraction too much, and the Mustang would roll into a flat spin. His breathing was steady. His training dissolved into instinct. He adjusted pitch with gentle pressure, countering yaw with coordinated aileron input. The aircraft flew crooked but controllable, a broken arrow still flying true. Behind him, Feldwebel Mueller's FW-190 pressed closer, closing from 6 o'clock low. Cannon flashes blinked from the German's wings, white bursts in the cold air. Carter saw tracers streak past his canopy, some missing by feet, some by inches. He kicked the rudder pedal again. No response. Then a realization. The jammed rudder fixed the Mustang's nose slightly left of centerline, forcing a constant drift. It was drag, but also disguise. The airflow wrapped around the fuselage in a diagonal pattern, changing how the plane cut through the air. He leaned into it, not fighting the jam, but using it. The Mustang began a controlled side slip. Instead of turning conventionally, Carter rolled slightly right, letting the jammed rudder pull the nose off axis. The aircraft now slid sideways through the air, losing energy but warping its flight path into an unpredictable arc. Mueller adjusted his gun sight, confused. The Mustang wasn't rolling. Then with practiced precision, Carter rolled inverted, cut power slightly, and let gravity pull him through a half-turn. The Mustang snapped downward using the slip as a pivot. The horizon spun, sky, cloud, ground, and then stabilized. Now Carter was behind Mueller. It lasted seconds, but those seconds felt endless. He pressed the trigger. The .650 caliber Brownings in his wings thundered, spitting a solid stream of tracers. The FW-190 shuddered under impact. A short burst to the right wing root, another to the tailplane. Flames erupted briefly before the aircraft rolled away, trailing smoke. Carter didn't watch it fall. He was too busy keeping his own aircraft alive. The maneuver had bled speed to near stall. He trimmed nose down, coaxing the Merlin back to full power. The engine responded, coughing once, then surging. The jammed rudder still fought him, but the Mustang climbed back toward altitude. Over the radio, his wingman's voice cut through static. "Red, you're smoking. You all right?" Control hit. "Rudder jammed," Carter replied. "Calm. Still flying." There was a pause. Then, "Hell of a move you pulled back there." He didn't answer. Words meant little when the machine still tried to kill you. The horizon tilted again. Leftward drag pulling at the tail. He corrected with a touch of opposite aileron, maintaining just enough lift to stay level. Below, the bomber stream continued unbroken. The German interceptors scattered, low on ammunition and fuel. The sky, for the first time that morning, felt empty. Carter exhaled. His gloves were slick with sweat. He scanned the gauges. Oil pressure stable, coolant temp rising, control surfaces unresponsive on the left pedal. He trimmed neutral as best he could. At 12,000 feet, the turbulence eased. The Mustang steadied. The immediate danger was over, but the flight home, more than 400 miles, would test endurance and control like never before. The stick vibrated constantly now, each oscillation a reminder of the damage behind him. He could neither turn cleanly nor yaw properly. Every correction required a calculated blend of roll and pitch. It was flying by feel, not by rule. And yet, within that damaged balance, Carter discovered something new: rhythm. The Mustang's instability had become predictable, a pattern of motion he could anticipate and guide. The aircraft was no longer fighting him, it was teaching him. When he later wrote his after-action notes, he would describe that sensation in simple words. Found a way to fly her broken. She wanted to turn left, so I let her, just not the way she expected. What Carter didn't know then was that his maneuver had been seen from the ground, by both Allied and German observers. To some, it looked like a desperate stall recovery. To others, it seemed deliberate, a pilot bending physics to his will. As he crossed back into friendly airspace, low on fuel, he could finally see the English coast through gaps in the clouds. The Merlin engine hummed unevenly but faithfully. The horizon was steady, though the rudder remained frozen, defiant to the end. He touched down at Leiston just before 1300 hours. The landing nearly catastrophic, full opposite aileron, heavy brake, the aircraft veering toward the grass before stopping. The ground crew rushed forward expecting the worst, but Carter climbed out, face calm, movements deliberate. He looked back at the tail, at the jagged hole that had changed everything. Then he simply said, "Don't fix it yet. I need to show them what it did." The fight had ended, but the lesson had just begun. The moment would soon move from the sky to the debriefing room, where instinct met analysis, and a single act of survival turned into doctrine. Leiston Airfield, Suffolk, England. Late afternoon, February 1945. The runways glistened under a light drizzle. The war might have still been raging across Europe, but here, amid the damp wind and the smell of hot oil, a new kind of quiet took hold. The kind that followed survival. Carter's Mustang sat in the maintenance hangar, its tail section covered with tarps. The mechanics moved around it like surgeons, eyes focused, tools clinking softly. Every hole, every dent, every rivet told a story of what had happened 25,000 feet above Germany. The rudder was locked in place, bent inward where a 20mm shell had torn through the control linkage. The damage was clean and precise, the kind that could have been fatal if not for luck, training, and instinct. Major Richard Browning, the squadron's operations officer, arrived mid-inspection. He was a meticulous man, an engineer before the war, and he studied the wreckage with quiet fascination. "Control jam here," one of the ground crew muttered. Rods twisted right through. He was flying half a plane. Browning crouched to eye level with the damage, running a hand along the fractured metal. "Half a plane," he repeated softly. "And somehow, he shot down a 190. When Carter entered the hangar, his flight suit still streaked with oil, Browning motioned him over. "You pulled off something they'll want to see in London," he said. "You realize what that maneuver looked like?" Carter shrugged, exhaustion dulling the edge of adrenaline. "I was just keeping her in the air." Browning smiled faintly. "Maybe, but you might have stumbled onto something more." That evening, in the debriefing room, the chalkboard still bore the map of the day's sortie, lines tracing outbound and return routes over central Germany. A dozen pilots gathered, tired faces lit by the glow of a single lamp. Cigarette smoke curled upward, mingling with the faint rumble of distant aircraft engines. Carter stood near the front, the rudder control diagram drawn behind him. His explanation was simple, almost mechanical. How the left rudder pedal froze, how the aircraft yawed continuously, how he used roll and power to compensate. He described the moment he realized that by not fighting the jam, he could force the Mustang into a sliding arc that threw off enemy aim. It was unorthodox, even dangerous, but in a sky filled with split-second decisions, danger sometimes became opportunity. Browning took notes, eyes narrowing thoughtfully. "You're saying you turned the side slip into an attack vector?" Carter nodded. "The Germans fly by sight and reflex. They expect clean geometry. Level turns, barrel rolls. When your plane moves sideways through the air, their gun sight can't predict the drift. The lead goes wrong." He paused, recalling the chaos of the chase. It wasn't planned, but it worked. One of the younger pilots, Lieutenant Harris, leaned forward. "Could it be done on purpose? Induce a side slip deliberately?" "Maybe," Carter replied, "but you'd have to balance it. Too much slip and you stall out. The trick is letting the air pull you, not the other way around." The room fell silent, the implications hanging heavy. In those days, new maneuvers weren't created in classrooms. They were born in survival, refined by men who had seconds to live or die. 2 days later, a team from the Airfighting Development Unit, AFDU, arrived from Duxford. They wanted to test it. The rudder jam maneuver, as Browning had half-jokingly called it, was recreated using a trainer Mustang fitted with adjustable rudder stops. Over open skies, test pilots simulated the condition: fixed rudder, varying slip angles, controlled descent turns. The results astonished them. At specific speeds and angles, the side slip generated unpredictable cross-flow patterns that disoriented opponents attempting to track visually. In mock dogfights, even experienced pursuers consistently overshot. The maneuver wasn't suitable for every situation. It sacrificed speed and precision, but it offered something rare: unpredictability. And unpredictability in air combat was survival. Reports were filed. Diagrams were drawn. The AFDU recommended incorporating elements of the technique into emergency flight procedures, not as a standard tactic, but as a last resort method for pilots with control damage. Back at Leiston, Carter became a quiet legend, not for heroics, but for the way he'd thought while under fire. Calm, analytical, precise. Pilots began calling it Carter's Drift, a nickname he disliked but tolerated. He flew 6 more missions before the war ended, his repaired Mustang, now with a perfectly functioning rudder, feeling somehow less alive, less personal. "She's too straight," he joked once. "Flies like she's forgotten what we learned together." Months later, after VE Day, as Europe lay in ruins and new jet engines began to whisper of the future, the lessons of that frozen rudder lived on quietly in technical manuals and flight lectures. Air combat instructors began teaching rudder-assisted roll control and asymmetric thrust recovery, concepts rooted in the same aerodynamic principles Carter had stumbled upon under fire. The idea was simple. Control damage didn't always mean disaster. If a pilot could understand airflow, he could think his way home. By 1946, the U.S. Air Force training circulars included sections on emergency flight under partial control loss, citing several wartime cases, though names were rarely mentioned. In one footnote barely noticed among hundreds, the phrase appeared: "Unintended side slip maneuver successfully employed during engagement over Leipzig sector, February 1945. That single line encapsulated everything. A broken rudder, a drifting plane, a pilot who refused to panic. In the decades that followed, as jet age replaced propellers and missiles replaced machine guns, the fundamental truth remained. Machines fail, but minds adapt. Carter's discovery was no longer about one man or one dogfight. It became a symbol of what defined aviation itself. In combat, perfection was rare. Adaptation was everything. Spring 1945. Europe was collapsing under the weight of Allied momentum. The skies above Germany, once dominated by the Luftwaffe, now belonged to the long-range escorts, the P-51s, P-47s, and Spitfires that guided bombers straight to the heart of the Reich. Yet among the many missions flown, one incident from February continued to circulate through squadrons and intelligence reports. Carter's rudder jam, as it came to be known, became a quiet case study in improvisation. At first, it was nothing more than a curiosity, another combat oddity in the endless paperwork of war. But when engineers at Farnborough and Duxford examined the reports, something caught their attention: the way airflow around the Mustang's fuselage behaved during asymmetric control. The data from the AFDU's test flights revealed something remarkable. At certain speeds, a jammed rudder didn't just cripple maneuverability, it changed the airflow pattern across the entire tailplane. The drag on one side created a vortex that could actually stabilize a damaged aircraft, allowing limited but controlled yaw. It was aerodynamics discovered not by calculation, but by desperation. And it wasn't unique to Carter's case. Engineers began revisiting crash reports from other pilots who had experienced similar control failures. A pattern emerged. Those who survived had instinctively used side slip and roll to balance out asymmetric forces. None had written manuals about it. They had simply felt it. For the men who studied flight at Farnborough's Royal Aircraft Establishment, it was a revelation. They began adding a new term to their notes: adaptive slip. The idea spread quietly through post-mission briefings. Flight instructors started mentioning it to young pilots. If your rudder locks, don't fight it. Ride it. Control with roll and throttle. Feel the slip. It wasn't official doctrine, yet, but word of mouth carried more weight than paperwork. Pilots trusted pilots. By the summer of 1945, as Allied air strategy turned toward the Pacific, several technical officers from the 8th Air Force proposed a formal study of combat-damaged control recovery. Among the examples cited in their report was the engagement southwest of Leipzig, the one that had started with a frozen rudder and ended in a confirmed kill. Carter's name appeared, briefly in the document, then disappeared in later versions. The military didn't trade in legends. It traded in procedures. But among those who flew, the legend endured. Somewhere over Japan, months later, a young pilot named Lieutenant Raymond Burke would experience a near-identical failure when his P-51's control cable snapped during a strafing run. Remembering a pre-mission lecture about Carter's drift, he applied the same technique: side slip, throttle balance, and trim. He made it back to Iwo Jima, landing with a cracked gear and shaking hands. When he stepped out, he said the same words Carter had once said in Suffolk: "Still flying." Back in England, Carter himself had already been reassigned to training duty. His combat tour was complete, his body weary but intact. He now instructed new pilots, younger, restless men who would likely never see a Luftwaffe fighter in the sky. During one lesson, he demonstrated what he called controlled asymmetry, rolling slightly into a turn while keeping rudder pressure fixed. The students laughed nervously as the Mustang wobbled across the horizon. "Don't fear instability," he told them through the intercom. "Fear not understanding it." The class fell silent. That line would stay with some of them long after the war ended. By VE Day, the war in Europe was done. The once feared Luftwaffe lay in ruins, its airfields filled with the wrecks of the same FW-190s and BF-109s that had once terrorized bomber formations. Yet the victory owed as much to adaptation as to firepower. Every pilot who returned home carried a piece of that lesson. That skill alone wasn't enough. Survival demanded imagination. Carter's jammed rudder became a metaphor for the entire war. Machines broke, plans failed, but men found a way through. And as the RAF and USAF prepared to face new threats in the jet age, that mindset, to adapt under pressure, would prove more valuable than any aircraft design. But the legacy of that moment didn't end on the airfield or in a test flight. Its echoes reached further, into post-war aviation research, accident analysis, and even the philosophies of future fighter schools. The broken rudder had turned into a tool of learning, and now history itself was beginning to listen. The war was over, but its lessons were only beginning to take shape. Across the Allied world, engineers and tacticians gathered in conference halls filled with blueprints, flight logs, and combat reports. They dissected everything the war had taught them, from radar to jet propulsion, from armor thickness to human endurance. In that ocean of analysis, the rudder jam case resurfaced quietly. It wasn't famous, nor was it heroic in the traditional sense, But to the minds designing the next generation of aircraft, it represented something essential: the fine line between loss of control and mastery of it. At Wright Field in Ohio, engineers studying damaged Mustangs found consistent evidence that partial rudder deflection created measurable aerodynamic side force, often saving the aircraft from unrecoverable spins. They began experimenting with trim tabs and servo assist, systems designed to simulate partial control loss safely, a method that would later evolve into adverse control testing used in jet development. In Britain, test pilots at Farnborough's Royal Aircraft Establishment ran experiments on prototype jets like the Gloucester Meteor and de Havilland Vampire. Their goal: understand how asymmetrical airflow affected stability at higher speeds. The findings, born from a single wartime improvisation, contributed to the earliest data on yaw roll coupling, a phenomenon that would define jet aerodynamics for decades. Carter's name never appeared in those technical papers, but his experience was there, written between the lines, hidden in equations that now guided the hands of test pilots and engineers. Meanwhile, Carter himself had left the service. The air war was behind him, though it had marked him permanently. He returned to civilian life quietly, taking a job as a test consultant for North American Aviation, the same company that had built his P-51 colleagues. Would later recall his peculiar insistence on trusting the air. He believed airflow could be read like a language. "The airplane always tells you what it wants," he'd say. "You just have to listen before you pull." His peers thought it was poetic. Engineers, however, realized it was practical truth. The age of computer-aided stability hadn't yet arrived. Every design still depended on human intuition. And in that fragile space between theory and instinct, Carter's philosophy fit perfectly. He participated in early tests for the F-86 Sabre, the aircraft that would become an icon of the Korean War. During one flight, a prototype developed a hydraulic fault mid-roll. The young test pilot froze. Carter, monitoring from the ground, advised through radio, "Ease it. Don't fight the fault. Let the air work for you." The pilot corrected smoothly, recovered, and landed safely. When the report was filed, Carter's only comment was, "It's the same lesson all over again." By the early 1950s, the U.S. Air Force had incorporated uncommanded yaw response and damaged control compensation into its advanced training syllabus. The principle was simple, but revolutionary. A pilot must not only react, but interpret his aircraft. And that mindset, adaptive control under duress, would define the next generation of flyers. From Korea to Vietnam, instructors repeated variations of Carter's idea. When control fails, don't panic, improvise. It became part of aviation's unwritten creed. Decades later, aviation historians tracing the lineage of post-war flight dynamics stumbled upon the original AFDU report. Yellowed pages, hand-marked diagrams, a brief annotation. Pilot compensated for jammed rudder through coordinated roll. One researcher from Cambridge Aeronautics, in a 1971 publication on emergency flight behavior, noted, "In this singular incident, we see the foundation of adaptive aeronautical control, an event that predates formal modeling by over a decade. It was the first time anyone had connected that forgotten dogfight over Leipzig with modern flight theory." For Carter, none of it mattered anymore. He had never sought recognition. To him, survival had been its own reward. When asked years later what he remembered most, he said quietly, "The sound of the Merlin. Even when everything broke, she never gave up." That sentence summed up the essence of wartime aviation, a partnership between man and machine, defined not by perfection, but by endurance. In a world that had seen cities burned and nations reshaped, one man's broken rudder seemed insignificant. Yet within it lay a universal truth. The future of flight, and of human progress itself, would always belong to those who adapted when nothing worked as planned. The sky had changed forever. The war was gone, but the lesson of that frozen control lived on, etched into the flight manuals, the training rooms, and the quiet resolve of every pilot who ever faced the impossible and found a way to keep flying. In the vast silence that followed the war, the sound of engines faded, but their echoes remained. Men who once ruled the skies now walked on quiet ground, carrying memories that no medal or archive could ever capture. Among them were the ones who had learned the hardest lesson of all, that mastery was not control, but understanding. Carter's flight, the one that began with a jammed rudder and ended in discovery, became a quiet metaphor whispered through generations of aviators. It wasn't about heroism or luck.